Tennessee carries concerns into spring football practice, but which position could keep Josh Heupel up at night? Hint, there's more than one. Welcome to the Volunteer State. I'm Tennessee beat writer Adam Sparks, along with columnist John Adams. On this episode, we're going to rank the worries for the Vols heading into spring practice. So which position is the biggest source of anxiety? Which position does UT most need to overperform? In other words, which problem absolutely must be solved in spring practice? These are all slightly different questions, but they have virtually the same answers. So we're going to tell you what the answers are. Not that we know, but we do. So let's get into it. John, spring practice starts on Friday. They're going to go for a little over a week, then take a week off for spring break, and then get back and do a little more practice. And before you know it, we'll be at the orange and white spring game. That's going to be on April 12th. But 15 practices, basically, if you count the spring game as number 15. And I'll have to say, we're going to get into these individually, but John, just overall, when I look at the roster and I look at the depth chart, there's a lot of questions and a lot of concerns, and I don't know if that's typical for this time of year, but I don't know if that's typical for this program, or like have we been spoiled a little bit by the last couple of years, seeing a lot of veterans come back and and just not really. It seems like the last couple of spring practices we've pointed to like one position, maybe two, not five or six. And I think maybe we've gotten spoiled just with a lot of these COVID seniors, 5th year, 6th year seniors, and not had as many questions. Or maybe this is a result of transfer portal. Why do you agree with me that there just seems to be a lot more holes on this roster going into spring practice?
Yeah, I agree there are more holes, but I go back to last year when I thought Tennessee would do really well, and it ended up making the playoff. I thought it would go 10-2, make the playoff. I was right about that, wrong about a lot of other things. But when I look back at that, even though I was optimistic about how well Tennessee would do, I still think there were questionable areas. And I think now in general, with every team, there are more questionable areas because of depth. Teams, because of the transfer portal, don't have the depth. Even the best programs don't have the kind of quality depth they once did. So if you lose a guy, all of a sudden something becomes an issue, like with Jermod McCoy with Tennessee this year at cornerback. I just think, so when I look at it this year and I look at all these positions, I agree with you. I went over your list and I agree with these things. I think there are a lot of concerns. Doesn't mean they won't be resolved. And it doesn't mean that the competition doesn't have concerns too. I think at least Tennessee has a returning starting quarterback. So some teams don't. So I just think in general, there's more uncertainty in college football now.
Yeah, it does seem like for decades and decades, we would always go into spring practice or preseason and just say, here's the starters returning. That was always the measurement, right? You have 14 out of 22 starters returning, and that was a metric. You would look at the depth chart at the end of the year, and I know this from being a college beat writer for 20 years or whatever. You would always take you plug in the returning starters, and then you would look at the backups from the previous year and just push them forward. There were twos, now they're ones. It was usually a simple process. And if you didn't, after you did those two steps, if you didn't have a probable starter, it was a big red flag. How could your starter's gone and your backup's not good enough? How did you not prepare for this? And now it just seems like it's the norm. I think this hit a lot of college football teams probably a year ago. I think Tennessee probably delayed it by a year because it had so many COVID seniors that returned for their fifth and sixth year. And so I think they've kicked the can down the road a little bit in a good way because they got to the playoff last year. But now I think we're coming into the era that I think some other programs have already gotten into, where your starter leaves and you either have to replace him through the portal, which means you have a newcomer, and that's a question mark automatically, or, and we'll get to this with Tennessee, or your backup who may have been your starter also went into the portal because they were tired of waiting for the opportunity that may be coming this season. We could see that in a number of positions. And so just the hole that you would normally have that would be shallow is much deeper. And I think it's hitting Tennessee more this offseason than any. And we'll probably get into this as we get deeper into spring practice, but there's definitely a youth movement of younger guys that are going to play a lot this year, just when you look at the lack of experience at some key positions. All right, so John, let's get into this. You already mentioned, so just full disclosure, I gave John my list of the 5 concerning positions in order before the pod, and I wanted him to come up with like his different ranking, but it turns out we think exactly alike and we have all the answers in the same order. So John, I don't think we can be wrong if we came up with the same list. Is that how this goes?
Yeah, I think that's pretty much a guarantee. Take it to the bank, bet what you will on our projections.
All right, so let's get into them. So these are 5 positions, and we've ranked them from least concerning to most concerning. But keep in mind, all 5 of these positions are of concern. So positions you won't see in here is like quarterback, as John mentioned. Nico's coming back. You have a starting quarterback who started and played and won. And so that's not a big concern. Tight end won't be on here because Miles Kitzelman has been around for a while. He's coming back. He's close to an all SEC caliber tight end. Not an issue there. So these are all positions of concern. We'll start with the least concerning of the concerning positions, and that is running back. I consider this a manageable concern. Dylan Sampson is gone. He was the SEC Player of the Year last year. You got Peyton Lewis coming back after a good freshman season. You've got Deshaun Bishop coming back, technically a walk-on, but he was a good, at times, number 2 at running back as a redshirt freshman last year. So you got Peyton Lewis, you got Deshaun Bishop, and then the new ingredient is a Star Thomas. He's a veteran guy, a Duke transfer. John, I see this as what I call a manageable concern because I think regardless of who Tennessee is plugged in at running back during Josh Heupel's tenure, they've all produced. Like they've rushed for, I don't know, it's like 2,500 yards at least every year. It's been, Jabari Small was not an all SEC back, but he produced. And Jalen Wright was a high draft pick. He produced. Dylan Sampson produced. I'm not saying any of these guys are that, but I think this is a concerning position. I just don't consider it really high up on the list because I feel like in this offense, with some talent certainly there with Peyton Lewis that's developing, and I think when you add Star Thomas to it, I think they're going to produce regardless of who's back there. And if they have these 2 guys, maybe 3 guys, I think they can get the job done, maybe just of a lesser degree than they did with Dylan Sampson. What's your concern-o-meter on this position?
Well, I think one concern is, and I agree with what you said, Josh Heupel has always found a productive core of running backs. That's true not just at Tennessee, but wherever he's been at UCF as a head coach, and even in Missouri, had really good depth at running back when he was offensive coordinator. This system just seems to churn out yards for running backs. So in that regard, so there's no 5-alarm fire here. I think my concern would be Tennessee relied so heavily on Dylan Sampson. He was the guy, the SEC Offensive Player of the Year, terrific running back, complete running back, speed, ran hard, broke tackles, durable. So I don't see that kind of player on the depth chart. I think Stark Thomas, I watched video of him. I'd watched a couple of Duke games and seen him. He's a productive running back. I think he falls in line with what Tennessee's had in the past. If you discount Dylan Sampson, then I like what I've seen of Peyton Lewis, and certainly Deshaun Bishop was a pleasant surprise. I think he gave Tennessee more than perhaps it had reason to expect. And I think he's got really good potential. So, and then there's always an issue, though, I think, Adam, with running backs in the SEC. I've seen teams going into some of the better teams when they're seemingly stacked at running back, and that depth can just disappear in a flash. I mean, you've got 4 proven running backs, and some teams still do. And all of a sudden, boom, you're down to 2. So I think running back is one of those things where it's always going to be a position of concern. Always.
Yeah, and I think I there's 2 other guys, Justin Baker, Dwayne Morris, that are coming in. Dwayne Morris is an in-state kid, an Oakland kid, Oakland High School. He's a 4-star. He may factor in there. We've seen freshmen play before, so that'll be something to watch. But yeah, I think this is one of those where it's the reason that this is concerning, I think, is that there could be compounding problems in offense. And we'll get to that in a minute. But, Dylan Sampson had a phenomenal season, record-breaking season. You can't take anything away from that. A little bit of that product of how defenses played Tennessee. They dropped multiple safeties into deep coverage. They kept everything in front of them. And they sort of dared Tennessee to throw short and do something with it after the catch, or just run the ball. And so Tennessee did take advantage. Already Tennessee's running backs and Josh Heupel's offense takes advantage of the wide splits of the wide receiver. So there's always extra space in the middle of the field to run. And then there was even more of it, I think, this past year at times. So any of these running backs, I think, are going to produce. And certainly as a unit, I think they're going to produce. But I think there are compounding problems because if the offensive line takes a step back and the wide receivers take a step back, and they were already an issue last season, then you've got to have a superstar at running back. And when I look at these 3 guys, Star Thomas has played a bunch, but I don't think he's coming here to be all SEC. At least I don't think we should expect that. Deshaun Bishop has been solid backup. I think he'll only continue to get better, but I do think his ceiling is not all SEC caliber. Peyton Lewis has the chance to develop into that, but he was just a freshman last year. So I think this is a manageable concern, but it could be a compounding concern because you can't have you can't have a lot of question marks in offense and just think that all of them are going to pan out. So running back a concern, but manageable. John, let's get to number 2, and that's the other side of the ball. Linebacker. If you just look at the depth chart, you may be scratching your head about why this would be a concern at all, because technically both starters return. Tennessee plays 2 linebackers in its base defense. Jeremiah Telander is back in the middle. Arian Carter is back on the outside on the weak side. And so you get back 2 starters. But I just think there were so many issues last season and the season before in terms of linebackers dropping into coverage, into pass coverage. I thought there were some inconsistencies there. And there were depth problems. When a guy would get hurt, I think there was a drop-off when you get to the 2s. We saw that when Keenan Peely got injured. Jeremiah Telander filled in. He was a solid starter, but I think he would have been a better as your first backup off the bench. But those 2 guys come back, Telander, Arian Carter. Key returners after them, Edwin Spillman, who played a little bit last year, talented as a freshman, but he was hurt. Jordan Burns, who we really haven't seen much of anything from, just a young guy. And then they'll have a couple 4-stars, a couple 3-stars that come in as early enrollees. I don't know if we should ever count on freshmen playing, but at that position, there's a possibility. I would say maybe Jaden Harmon would be my pick out of those. He's the guy that was headed to Alabama, then changed his mind and came to Tennessee. 4-star, early enrollee. William Inge, the linebackers coach, likes to play a lot of guys and likes to play young guys. So I think one of those freshmen will probably factor in, and I would just say Harmon at least until I see them in spring practice. But it's, I just feel like you've got to have better then you've got to have more than just those first two guys, T-Lander and Carter, and those two guys have to be better. Edwin Spillman, I think, is the guy I would circle in this bunch that has to be a difference maker. And Arian Carter's got to be an all-SEC caliber. And I think right now, I think that position is just sort of a C+, B- group, and it's got to be a B+, A- group. And so I think it's a moderate concern. John, where are you at with the linebackers?
Yeah, pretty much on the same page there, Adam. And you bring up something, Arian Carter, can he be an all-SEC caliber player? I'm not sure on that. Maybe he can. But I think when you look at all these positions, position groups, and you say depth, experience, it also helps when you have a star. When you have a guy that he's going to play lights out. You don't have to worry about him. He, as you said, a difference maker. Somebody can make a game-turning play, that kind of guy. And I don't see that here. I'm not saying it can't. You mentioned Spellman certainly has potential from what he did as a freshman. Maybe Carter will develop further. But it's not like you're going into the season saying, and you're thinking all SEC linebackers, you're inserting Tennessee's linebackers in that conversation. I don't see that right now. So that would be a slight concern for me.
Yeah, and maybe I glossed this over with the running backs to begin with, but if we're talking about problems and we're talking about those that could possibly be answered or that Tennessee would like to answer in the spring, with a running back, Star Thomas was my answer. If Star Thomas, the Duke transfer, really shows them something in spring, you can feel better leaving spring practice saying, okay, this guy may be a difference maker. At linebacker, as I mentioned, I think that's Edwin Spillman. They could feel much better about Arian Carter. They could feel good about Jeremiah T-Lander. I just feel like Edwin Spillman could be a guy that if everything pans out, they could say leaving spring practice, Edwin Spillman could start. He could push one of these guys out. And if you have that answer coming out of spring, I think you feel much better about that position. And I think that's a decent possibility. I think Spillman, if healthy, kind of gives them what they thought Arian Carter was the year before him. So I think there's a reasonable chance to get good answers to that problem in spring practice. All right, John, now we get a little more serious. The top three biggest concerns. And this is a funny one. This one could move around on the list, but going into spring practice, and as we record this on Tuesday, this is where this sits, and it's defensive back. This could go up or down the list in spring practice. This could go up or down the list depending on audience when you hear this podcast. Because the biggest question at defensive back right now is Ricky Gibson going to be on this team in the 2025 season? And that could change any minute. It may change again by the time this is published and you guys hear it. But Ricky Gibson, through, I think, his agent, I think is the best way to say that, through his representation, has had it leaked that he is looking to go into the transfer portal. Last season, Ricky Gibson was a good first-year starter at corner. Obviously, Jermod McCoy was the better of the two. He was an All-American. Jermod McCoy tore his ACL in January in an off-season workout while he was back home in Texas. And so then Ricky Gibson goes from pretty good returning starter to your best shutdown corner, at least until Jermod McCoy comes back. And we don't know when that's going to be or when it is, how close to 100% he would be. An ACL is not an injury that corners recover from quickly. There's a lot of stopping and starting and twisting if you're playing cornerback. So a knee injury is not easy to come back from. So, but Ricky Gibson, as we record this, we don't know if Ricky Gibson's going to be practicing, if he's not going to be practicing, if he's going to be a quote unquote college holdout, which is a strange thing to say these days. But we don't know if he's going to go into the portal or maybe if he gets more NIL money or whatever this is about, if his demands are met, if he stays at Tennessee. And that's what determines how much of a concern this is. If Ricky Gibson returns, then at corner you have Ricky Gibson, you have Jermod McCoy eventually, but certainly not for a while. You've got Andre Turrentine at safety, returning starter. You have Boo Carter, a very good young player at star position. That's nickel. And then, the other corner while McCoy's out would be Jalen McMurray, solid veteran. Caleb Beasley is an up-and-coming guy. At safety, you'd have Jacoby Thomas, some other names people will be watching in the spring. Idris Farouk, a good young safety. And then some other guys that have been around. And then there will be some early enrollees here. I think like 4 different DBs will be here as freshmen early enrollees. But John, I the way that I term this, I think defensive back is a rising concern, and it's a skyrocketing concern at this point, because a month and a half ago, if you had asked me how I feel about the secondary, I would say, great. You've got an All-American at one corner. You've got Ricky Gibson, a solid starter at the other. You got one of your safeties back. You got Boo Carter after a freshman All-SEC, all-freshman season. You just got to plug a hole or two, and it's about depth. We fast forward to now, and Tennessee could be without both corners. They're already out. They're already looking for another safety. It's a rising concern, and I think a lot just hinges on whether or not Ricky Gibson is in the lineup, not just in spring, but if he's here in the fall. Is it that much of an X factor, John, whether or not Ricky Gibson's playing?
I really don't think so. I think we're in the negotiation phase. His agent, Team Ricky, whatever you want to call it, saw leverage here when Jermod McCoy went down with a torn ACL. It sounds brutal, sounds harsh. It's the world in which we now live. Ricky Gibson value skyrocketed when McCoy went down. So he sees his opportunity to make more money, and he's going to capitalize on it. I don't think Tennessee can afford to let him walk. I just don't see that. So I think they will come to terms and negotiate, and he'll be back. So I don't see that as an issue. But what I do see as an issue is Jermod McCoy. We hear all the time about these guys making an amazing recovery, head of schedule, all this kind of good stuff with torn ACLs. But how many times do we see a guy come back from a torn ACL and he's just as good in his first season back as he was before the injury? It is extraordinarily rare. I can't think of anything that comes to mind. And then, as you emphasized, a position of this nature. I think Tennessee lost when Jermod McCoy went down in January with that torn ACL off-season workout injury. Tennessee lost an All-American cornerback for the season. Now, he may come back at some point, but he's not going to come back as an All-American cornerback. I just don't think that's possible. He may be that eventually down the road, but I think that just takes time for that injury and all the wear and tear, the cuts, the jagged turns, everything associated with that position. You lose a half step at that position, it's a difference in an interception and a touchdown. So I just don't see him being that much of a factor this season. And I don't mean to sound overly pessimistic. I'm just basing that on what I've seen with that injury and what I know about that position.
Yeah, if you could go back in time, you'd probably tell Jordan Matthews to hang around, because Jordan Matthews was a backup young corner who went into the portal, ended up at Vanderbilt. Had he known the depth issues that were coming, maybe he would have hung around. Maybe he would have asked for more NIL money. That seems to be the one.
Well, there's no doubt he would ask for more money. Everybody asks for more money.
Sure. I mean, if we went back to early January, I would say Tennessee would maybe look at adding a corner or adding a defensive back in the portal for depth. If you go to the end of January, I would say they absolutely need to add a corner for depth because of Jermod McCoy's injury. If you go a month after that, I would say you probably need to add 2 corners because of Jermod McCoy's injury and Ricky Gibson's potential holdout. That they've gone from needing maybe no DBs to needing a couple in the portal. But the problem is you can't really count on having good options in the spring portal window, which opens, I think it's April 16th, right after spring practice. You just, because you're getting somebody's leftovers, they're not going to be able to practice and be in the system. So, Ricky Gibson has a lot of leverage here, and that's why I expect him to be back. But neither result would really surprise me in this day and time. But it's a rising concern. The way to, I think, calm the coaches a little bit in spring practice, I would say, well, number one, Ricky Gibson saying, I'm here, I'm good, I'm happy with the situation, I'm here to stay. That would be number one. Number two would be, I think, Caleb Beasley coming on. He's a young DB, is looked at as a corner, could maybe play safety. He's an in-state kid. He's from Nashville, Lipscomb Academy. He got here as a weird thing. Him and Edwin Spillman, both from Lipscomb, got here in the middle of spring last year. It's one of those funny little things that UT can do where you come in and do like a quarter, like a half a semester. And so they got in the middle of spring. So I almost wouldn't even count them as spring practice guys last year, early enrollees. But he's been here now a full year, and if Beasley can make a move and look like he can maybe start at corner, has a chance there, I think they would feel better because Jalen McMurray could be your starter there. He's solid. He's a veteran. He's just better as your number 3 corner. But as we mentioned at the top of the pod, this is a different era, and you just gone to the days where you say, hey, you've got mostly all starters coming back and few questions, and this is a big question here. And if Ricky Gibson is in the lineup, you solve like one of 3 problems in the secondary, but you've got others to answer. And I don't think him coming back answers all of them. Secondary was pretty good last year. It was. And if you don't fix these problems, you potentially could go back to when it struggled in Josh Heupel's first couple of years. And Tennessee certainly doesn't want that. All right. Even deeper into it, John. I think this is where I thought we would get some disagreements, but apparently we don't. I think we could probably have some disagreements with the listeners. But number 2, the most concerning position is offensive line. And we're just doing that as one big unit. I could say right tackle or center or either guard spot. You could even say left tackle where Lance Hurd is coming back. That's a problem because it was a problem last year. But we're going to make it one big unit. This is a big problem because there are so many moving parts at offensive line. 4 starters are gone. Cooper Mays is gone. He was all SEC. Spraggins is gone, was all SEC. There are a couple of guys that probably you're not worried too much that they left. I think they need a little bit of a reset at a couple positions. But the only starter coming back is Lance Hurd. The left tackle, the Tennessee paid a lot of money to get out of the portal a year ago out of LSU. He was bad early last season. He got better by the end of the year. I don't know that he ever got close enough to what they need him to be. But he is your remaining starter there at left tackle. The other spots are sort of up in the air. They got 2 good portal pickups. At least we think good portal pickups. Wendell Moy. I believe it's Wendell Moy, not Wendell Moe. We've been saying Wendell Moe. M-O-E, I think it's pronounced Moy, Polynesian descent. Wendell Moe, he was an all Pac-12 guy a couple years ago at Arizona. Was at Arizona this last year. He's Pac-12 2 years ago when the Pac-12 still existed. So that's a good pickup. And I hear a lot of good things out of Tennessee that they think he's going to be good. He may even be the best lineman out of this bunch, they think. So as an experienced guy, the guy at the portal, he'll play one of the guard spots. I have no doubt about that. Sam Pendleton is the other transfer, the guy at the portal, Notre Dame. He was a part-time starter at Notre Dame at guard. But this is critical. Last spring at Notre Dame, he practiced at center. They were trying to figure out a way for him to be a center, and he showed a little bit of promise there, but some inconsistency. I want to see if they try him at center in spring, because he could be the long-term replacement for Cooper Mays if he works out there. But Pendleton will be battling at center or guard, so you get two transfers in on the interior. And maybe the biggest question here is David Sanders ready to start as a true freshman? You would think at right tackle, since Hurd is playing left tackle. David Sanders is a 5-star freshman. He was the number one tackle in this class. Some people think the number one player in the country in this class. We've seen offensive linemen start as freshmen. You don't see it very often. They have to be an elite 5-star talent, but it's happened. It's happened at Tennessee. So I see a lot of questions there. The reason this is not number one for me is that although I see a lot of questions, I actually see a whole lot of answers or potential answers. I think there are a lot of options there for Glenn Ellerby, the O-line coach, to try out. I want to mention a few others. William Satterwhite is potentially the replacement at center. He was a freshman last year. Jesse Perry, they like a bunch. He practiced well, at least as a freshman last year. Larry Johnson could be competing at tackle, and there's endless number of guys that recruit necks have heard of, but just the run-of-the-mill Tennessee fan, they don't know a lot of these names that I'm throwing out of young guys who have not played, but Tennessee knows them. John, I listed this as a big concern for me, but not the biggest. Why is this a big concern for you, and why is this not the biggest?
Well, it's certainly a big concern. David Sanders definitely needs to start
right away. Week one.
Yeah, to me, Tennessee's tackle play early on last year was horrible.
Yeah,
and okay, let's say Lance Hurd gets better. Lance Hurd is not what I thought he would be. He's not what Tennessee needed him to be. Now, there's a chance he'll get better, but he has a long way to go. When Tennessee got him from LSU, a 5-star recruit, a guy who was supposed to be, you think of a 5-star recruit as an all-SEC player eventually. Now, I don't see that at all with him. He was a big problem. And, yeah, he got better, but my gosh, he almost had to get better. How could you get any worse? I mean, Tennessee's tackle play, when you look back on last season, you think this was 10-2 team, made the playoff, won all these games, had a good year, and you go back and say, man, how did they do it with those two offensive tackles? Quite an accomplishment. Best case scenario, Lance Hurd is a much better player, but I don't see how that's anything you can count on. I feel better about those the transfer portal guys. They seem to have what it takes to help solidify the offensive line. They've got experience. You mentioned Wendell Moy, he might be an all-SEC candidate, so that would be a good thing. But do you replace Cooper Mays? He was such an integral part of the offense. And I'm not just talking about talent here, about experience and just about knowing the system and kind of making guys around him better and just helping the overall functionality of the offense. I don't know if Tennessee can have that again. I look at this, when I look at it, I just don't know if this offensive line overall can be much better than it was last year.
And last year wasn't bad though.
It wasn't bad, no. I guess what I'm looking for, we got all these areas of concern.
Mm-hmm.
I want to see an area that don't have to worry about that. Okay, you can go. We could talk about the defensive line. Maybe we can do that in another podcast. But I'm just saying, at some point, you just keep talking about concerns, and you said it earlier. There's potential these can be resolved, but can you figure everyone will be resolved? I don't think you can count on that. But the offensive line is so crucial to me because you got to protect your quarterback. You want to keep your defense off the field. We go back to what happened last year, and you alluded to it already. Teams taking away the big play, and this is going to get to another area of concern. Teams taking away the big play from Tennessee.
Mm-hmm.
Take away the big play. Well, then you better be able to grind out the yardage. You got to go 75 yards in 12 plays now. You got to be able to do that. And Tennessee did that a lot. Not in its losses, it didn't. So you got to have something there. So to me, I want David Sanders to just be a star. I mean, this guy to me, and he has that kind of potential. So a best case scenario, David Sanders starts right away. Lance Hurd comes in. He's comfortable now. He's confident. He had an injury last year in preparation. He's healthy. So suddenly the tackle position solidified, the interior of the offensive line. There's enough experience and proven players there to say, okay, I think this is not such a big concern anymore. That's a possibility, and I think that's what Tennessee needs to hope for.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting conversation about what Glenn Ellerby does to figure out the combination of linemen he's going to use. Because there's so many things that this offensive line has to get right in spring and then eventually in fall camp. You want your best five. I mean, just your best five. You line up in a one-on-one drill, and these are the best five linemen. You want that to begin with. But you also want the five that can run this offense well enough. It's different than other offenses. You want guys that can play at that high pace. We assume that they're going to try to get back to some tempo because they got away from it some last year, and I don't think it bode well for them. And are those different guys? Like, are your five best offensive linemen just individuals? Are they also your five best that can run this offense and go at this pace? Like last year, Lance Hurd came in. He had some ability, but he was injured early, and then he was not in great shape. It takes a while to get in shape to run this at this pace. So is there a chance that Glenn Ellerby goes with returning guys who may not be in the top five linemen because they know the offense, they know the pace, they know they practiced in it for a year or two, rather than your best? And I think, that's a little probably emblematic there is David Sanders. As David Sanders is going to have to get used to this pace. He's going to have to get used to this offense. He's going to have to learn it. I'm sure he's learned some of it already. But does a guy who's been in the system a year or two start over him because they just feel comfortable with playing guys that are less talented but know the system better? My question with that is, if you're going to do that in game, if you're going to hand it off to David Sanders in game 3 or game 4, why not do it in game 1? I think there are some big questions there about who are the best five, but who are the five you're most comfortable with. And you would like that to be the same five, but I doubt it's going to be that. I have some hope for this because, like I said before, there's a lot of potential answers to these problems. Left tackle, Lance Hurd, whether you think he's good, bad, or probably something in between the two, Lance Hurd should be your left tackle. He's going to be your left tackle. He's a returning starter. So that leaves 4. Moy definitely will be a starter at one of the guards. Pendleton will be a starter at the other guard or potentially center. And you sort of have to figure out who the combination of Pendleton and somebody else at the guard and center spot. Could be Satterwhite or Jesse Perry. They like a lot. And then that leaves right tackle. Could be David Sanders. Could be somebody else. Bennett Warren was sort of the talk of camp last year when he arrived. A high 4-star guy. He's like top 5 or 6 tackles in the country. We easily forget a guy like that because David Sanders got here. But Bennett Warren is 6'7", 340-something pounds, just a mammoth of a human. A young guy. He was definitely one of those guys they thought, this guy has something, but he's got a red shirt, which is pretty typical for young offensive linemen. Does he get into the mix? So I think there's a lot of, I think this is one of the more interesting positions to watch at spring practice, because I think there's endless combinations of what they could try on the offensive line. And I feel somewhat confident that they could find the right combination with this many possibilities. I will say, I think that there's going to be some guys go into the portal from this team after spring practice. Tennessee's knocking on wood that it's not Ricky Gibson, but I would say some pretty good candidates would be some of those offensive linemen, because I've jotted down like 12 guys that I could see get in the mix, and it's really going to be like 7 guys. And so who of these young offensive linemen believe that they're good developmental guys that are eventually going to start and play? And how many of these guys see the handwriting on the wall and say, hey, this was my shot. There's 4 open spots and I didn't get close to claiming any of them. Maybe I need to jump in the portal and go to mid-major school or a low-end major. And so I it wouldn't shock me at all if a couple of offensive linemen jump into the portal, the guys that are weeded out by the end of spring practice. But I don't know who those are, and I'm going to be curious to see who they are. It's not going to be David Sanders. It's not going to be Wendell Moy. It's not going to be Sam Pendleton. It's not going to be Lance Hurd. And I feel pretty good about those 4, and it's a coin flip on who some of the others are. All right, John. Most concerning position on the 2025 Tennessee roster. I waffled on this one a little bit because I thought maybe offensive line should be one, but it's got to be wide receiver. It's just got to be wide receiver. You know, offensive line, I feel like it'll just sort of work itself out. And if it's not, probably won't be great, may not be good, but it'll be serviceable to pretty good. If wide receiver is not fixed, this is not a good football team. This is not a playoff team. This is not a in the mix of the playoff team. This is a team that goes to some random bowl in late December. Right? I mean, I mean, random bowl, but you know, I mean, this is
that the name of a new bowl?
Yeah,
the random
bowl.
bowl is played on December 23rd. Yeah,
23rd would be great. I've covered those before. You're done at Christmas. It's wonderful. That's one of the good things about the playoffs is this. You know, if you win in the first round, you go. Not really a win-win for guys that cover this. But yeah, I mean, wide receiver, this offense, if it doesn't have a wide receiver, it's worse on offense than it was last year. And last year, the numbers were still pretty good, but we all saw it. And we saw it some 2 years ago too. This has not been a Josh Heupel offense for the better part of 2 seasons, not the one that we've grown accustomed to. You have a 5-star quarterback that's supposed to be a Heisman candidate. You were a playoff team last year, and you have recruited wide receivers, and it's just it hasn't been there. It wasn't there at the end of last year, and it was a very underperforming position, and it affected everything else. I mean, I said it earlier. Defenses looked at Tennessee and said, we're not going to let you beat us deep, and so we don't think you can beat us on offense the way that Josh Heupel's offense has done before. And a lot of that had to do with there was a lack of respect for Tennessee's playmaking receivers because they didn't have them. Dante Thornton would hit one big play a game. Brew McCoy just was not 100%. And they picked up Chris Brazzell in the portal. He had a big catch to win it against Alabama, but aside from that, I think you could just say he was so-so through the year. And the 5-star Mike Matthews just really didn't play that much. And when he did, he made a couple plays, but not what you were hoping out of his first season. So here's what Tennessee has coming back at wide receiver. Chris Brazzell, who is technically a returning starter. Mike Matthews, who's a 5-star receiver a year ago. He's going into his second season. Braylon Staley, was a promising 4-star guy that we really didn't see until the playoff. Amari Anderson is an Alabama transfer, but he redshirted there, so we haven't seen him. He's an in-state guy. Was good coming out of high school, but he hadn't played. And then a couple of 4-star freshmen that are early enrollees: Travis Smith, Radarius Jackson. So, John, I mean, I have a couple questions out of that bunch. Number one, that's not enough receivers. Like, they actually have to have more bodies, and they'll have to take care of that in the transfer portal after the spring. But even if you don't even get to the sheer numbers, is there a guy that you can count on to beat defenses in the SEC out of that bunch that's guaranteed a go-to receiver? I don't know that there is.
Not at all. I thought Chris Brazzell was a big disappointment based on what he did at Tulane, based on Tennessee's needs. They needed him to be a really good player. You mentioned he had the big catch against Alabama. That's nice, but overall, you just didn't get the production you wanted. He's not the kind of guy that stretched a defense repeatedly. I was talking to former football coach Watson Brown recently for a column, and he was kind of analyzing Tennessee's offense. Watson, one of the really terrific offensive play callers in college football, was head coach at a lot of different places. He's from Cookeville. Watson said Tennessee has to get back to having one of those receivers who scares people to death, i.e. a Jalen Hyatt of 2022 who torched Alabama for 5 touchdowns, had over 200 yards on about 5 catches. Incredible game. Tennessee didn't have that last year. It didn't have it the year before. Occasionally, Dante Thornton, as you mentioned, would make a play, and he had the speed, certainly, but he wasn't durable. He wasn't consistent. It took him a whole year almost to adjust to Tennessee's system. So Tennessee just didn't have that last year. For this offense to work, or certainly to flourish, it needs a big play wide receiver, and it doesn't have one. I thought that was crucial in the transfer portal to go out and get. There were so many wide receivers available this year, more than I've ever seen. Not that we've got a long history of transfer portal players in this era, but nonetheless, there were so many players available, and Tennessee didn't get one of those guys that you could say, yeah, he can do it. We know he can do it. Just look at his track record. Look at his numbers. Tennessee didn't get that. So this is a huge concern for Tennessee. If it hopes for this offense to become what it was, anything close to that in 2022, it's got to get a receiver who scares defenses, as Watson Brown said, and at least stretches the field.
Yeah, it seems like, and I know we keep doing this, but I think it's fair. We keep comparing the receiving core to Tennessee's best receiving cores of Josh Heupel's first 2 seasons, when they just took the top off of any defense. And every guy seems like they have is like as we call a poor man's version. Brew McCoy last year was a poor man's version of Cedric Tillman. Squirrel White was a poor man's version of Jalen Hyatt. And that can happen in a given year at a given position. It can't happen across the board. I was having a conversation with a UT fan a couple of days ago where he saw how well Dante Thornton was at the NFL Combine. Ran a 4.3. A lot of teams are excited about him. He's probably going to get drafted. And this fan said, wow, why was he such a disappointment at Tennessee? And I said, hold on. He wasn't a disappointment at Tennessee. He led the SEC in yards per catch, 25 yards a catch. He had 6 touchdowns. He led the team in receiving yards. If you take what Dante Thornton did and compare it to Javonte Payton on the 2021 team, they're kind of the same guy. They give you 1 big play, maybe 2 every game. The difference between those 2 seasons is that Javonte Payton was the 3rd option in that receiving core. Dante Thornton was the 1st option in this receiving core. And that's a problem 3 needs to be a 1. And because you don't have a 1 and 2, everybody's a 3. And that was the problem last season, and it could be the problem this season because I think Chris Brazzell was a 3 or a 4 last year if you're ranking wide receivers. Mike Matthews is a 5-star, so that means he has the potential to be a 1, but I don't know that he is until he is. Braylon Staley, is he a guy that can take the top off as a slot receiver? I don't know. I mean, they didn't put him on the field last year until they had to at the end of the season. Amari Jefferson, the Alabama transfer, I'm curious to see him. He had I think it was a hip injury that kept him sidelined for a lot of his freshman year at Alabama. So I don't know that we're going to see him at 100%. This is an enormous concern because I see a lot of problems and I don't know if I can pick out a single solution. Chris Brazzell getting much better is a possible solution. Is that going to happen? I don't know. Maybe. I don't think Chris Brazzell is going to turn into a number 1 receiver. I think you can only hope for him to turn into a good complementary receiver, like a number 2, so to speak. Is Mike Matthews going to skyrocket from freshman who flashes a little bit to a number 1 receiver? I don't know that that's going to happen. Maybe the best you could hope for is that he sort of levels up into like a number 2. Can Braylon Staley move forward? Can Amari Jefferson give him something in year 1? Can any of these freshmen pan out? It's just, I think there's you're sort of pinning hope on like 7 different problems and needing almost all of them to work in your favor. And I think that's tough. Mike Matthews would be the biggest move of this group. If he looks like a dominant wide receiver in his second year, if Mike Matthews does, then you can start to fill in the gaps after that. That levels up Chris Brazzell. That levels up Braylon Staley. It gives Amari Jefferson a chance. If Mike Matthews is a dominant SEC wide receiver, then suddenly you can plug a freshman in there and they can produce because they're not getting the attention that they would get if you just have, run-of-the-mill receivers beside them. So I think Mike Matthews has got to be the X factor there. I know there's also the talk of could Boo Carter be over there. He might be at wide receiver. I just think with the problems you already have in the defensive secondary, I don't think you should pin your hopes on a guy jumping over and playing both ways to be a dominant factor. He's a guy that could make a difference in a few plays. I don't think he's a guy that's going to change your position. So if Mike Matthews can play like a 5-star receiver, it fixes some of your problems, but I think you would still have some more problems beyond that. John, what's the chances that wide receiver is fixed in spring practice?
No, I don't see a lot of fixes in spring practice ever at any position. So no, I don't think he'll be fixed. And we won't know until you get into games next year. When I look at, position analyses and you talk about how big a concern one group is or another, I always try to put it in context of the competition. And I look around this league at all the good receiving cores in this league. Tennessee right now has one of the worst receiving cores in the SEC.
Which is startling, but true.
True. Yeah.
From an off-season perspective, sure.
Yeah, it doesn't mean it will still be, but I look at places like, Auburn, Ole Miss, Texas A&M, LSU. I can just go on and tick off the names of guys who already have accomplished more. And so many of these teams did it for example, LSU went out, is already pretty good it's always seemingly good at wide receiver, and goes out and gets 2 really good transfers, including Barry and Brown from Kentucky. So you just see what the competition is doing. Wide receiver has become a position of importance in this era of college football, more so than running back. And SEC teams are recruiting and going after transfers accordingly. And Tennessee just didn't get that done. I mean, in a best case scenario, everything goes just right. There's a surprise guy. Mike Matthews becomes the 5-star, what you want a 5-star recruit to be in his first season as a starter. Chris Brazzell flips a switch and becomes much better than he was last season. This is still not one of the top 6 or 7 receiving corps in the SEC.
Yeah, and I think that's the second part of the problem is that there aren't many options. We talked about offensive line where you've got a lot of problems, but you've got a lot of potential solutions. You got a lot of options there to plug guys in. They just don't have enough bodies. I mean, if you're playing tomorrow, your starters are Brazzell, Matthews, and Staley, and then your backups are an injured transfer, Amari Jefferson, and some freshmen. Like, it's not that they needed to add a guy in the portal. It's they needed to add like at least 2 guys in the portal and 2 good guys in the portal. And instead they added Amari Jefferson who may pan out, but they need more bodies there, and they need better bodies there for the lack of a better term. And as I mentioned before, this is a compounding problem but it's also a compounding solution, because if wide receiver is good, you don't have to worry that much about running back. If wide receiver is good, suddenly that offensive line does not have to hold up that long. And then your quarterback is suddenly much better, and your offense is much better, and you have a big playability, and then you're not putting stress on your defense. And, 20 years ago, we would never say that wide receiver was a hinge position in that way. But in this era, and especially in this offense, we've seen it. We've seen it. They had the best wide receiving core in the country a couple of seasons ago, in 22, and I'd say maybe in 21 also. And that everything worked because of that. And when the wide receiving core started to dip, everything about the offense dipped. And it's not one necessarily affects everything else, but it certainly was a pretty big factor. And this is by far the worst receiving core in a Tennessee offseason I've seen under Heupel. By far. I mean, you could say going into his first season, that was potentially a bad receiving core because we didn't know much about Javonte Payton. He hadn't produced, and Cedric Tillman hadn't produced, and Jalen Hyatt hadn't produced. You did have Velus Jones Jr. coming back, and he was a productive all SEC caliber returner receiver. So you had something. At this point, man, there are some big, big questions at that position, and there's just not as many solutions. But the biggest solution I can see is Mike Matthews has to come in and be Nico's best friend and dominate. And you would love to have Mike Matthews had to go against Jermod McCoy for an entire spring. Instead, these receivers that are going to try to level up are going to be going against probably Tennessee's backups and last year's third string corners. And that's where these problems again compound.
Adam, when you go back to Tennessee's last public appearance, the disparity between Ohio State's receiving corps and Tennessee's, and Tennessee has dropped off in receivers since then. Tennessee's receivers could not get open. Couldn't beat Ohio State. You got to be able to have some guys that can beat one-on-one coverage, and Tennessee couldn't do that against an elite team. You saw Ohio State receivers do it repeatedly. Not just one, not just 2, 3 guys. And Tennessee couldn't do that. So the disparity at that position alone, Tennessee had a huge disadvantage to overcome right there. And of course, it couldn't come close. But yeah, we'll see how this unfolds. But I don't think there's any question that receiving corps. I go back when I think about Heupel's other teams. It's sometimes the secondary. I think the receiving corps right now, the questions about the receiving corps are the questions comparable to what I had about some of Tennessee's secondaries under Heupel, when I thought, man, I don't know if these guys can play a lick. I don't know if they can get it done at all. This is a glaring weakness. Now I think that shifted, and it's a receiving core we look at in the same light.
Yeah, it's just, I think before, as you said, you thought if the secondary is bad, they can weather that storm. If the secondary is good, it's a bonus. And now I think there are questions in the secondary, and there are bigger questions at wide receiver. It's just, I know this is the basis of this episode, but there's more positions of concern than we're accustomed to. And I think part of that is a sign of the times and the era of college football we're in. A part of that is just Tennessee is now cycling through a reloading. That's the most positive spin I can put on it. Maybe not rebuilding, but possibly reloading. They would rather it be reloading than rebuilding. We will find out which one in the spring, and certainly after that once we get to the fall. So those are the biggest questions for spring practice for Tennessee. We'll see if they can answer them. We will follow along during spring practice. You can keep up with all our coverage of Tennessee football spring practice, as well as basketball, men and women going deep into the headed towards the postseason. And baseball is already the number one team in the country. Not a big surprise there. So keep up with all our coverage at KnoxNews.com. Please share this podcast. And thank you for listening to this edition of the Volunteer State.